Welcome, everyone, to our fireside chat on what qualities set teams up for innovation success. So today we will be diving into three main topics. First, how to identify change makers and get them to join a coalition of the willing. Ways to use external networks and why they're critically important to your team. And finally, how to shape your role as an innovation leader to ensure a safe and productive environment for risk-taking and challenging the status quo. So at the end of our discussion today, you'll hopefully have some guiding principles for setting up innovation teams for success and more confidence to help guide you in your role. So first, some introductions. I'm Rachel Gordon, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. I run an innovation agency called Triple Agent, where I help in-house innovators build systems for repeatable innovation. You can find more about me on LinkedIn or on my website, which is tripleagent.co. And today we have with us as our special guest, Amy Radin, whose corporate career as an innovation trailblazer has included executive innovation roles at big companies like American Express, AXA, and Citi. She currently advises leaders on how to turn innovation ideas into commercial successes. And she's the author of the award-winning book, The Changemakers Playbook: How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. So the way today's fireside chat is going to work is that Amy and I will spend about 30 minutes just talking through the three topics I mentioned. And then we will move to a Q&A session, and I'll start off the Q&A probably with a question or two. But what we really want is for you guys to also join in the conversation and for it to be interactive. And so we invite you to actually, as we're chatting, put things into the chat, any questions that you have of your own. And we will definitely get to them at the end of the session. So before we kick off, I wanted to throw out a challenge question to everybody to get us thinking about our topic today. So I will put this in the chat right now so everybody has it, and feel free to respond. Here we go. This is our challenge question. In your experience, what qualities make an innovation team, both the individuals themselves and the team, successful? So I think Amy and I are both curious to hear what people have to say about that. So I'll keep keeping an eye on it as we start our conversation. So yeah, let's enough introductions. Let's get started here. Welcome, Amy. Thank you for being here. And let's start with your bio, which I'm really curious about. You say in your bio that you're an advisor who helps leaders turn commercial ideas into successes. And I think I'd love to know a little bit more about that. Like, what is that? What is a breakdown of what that entails?
And I just want to say to start, thanks so much for joining me in this, for this conversation, Rachel, and all the effort you put into helping us be ready. And really, really looking forward to spending the next hour with you and with everybody who's joined the call. So, the thing I've observed often over the years is that, innovation is, easy to talk about, hard to execute. And when you start to unpack what does it really take to set teams up for success, picking the right people is it's only one dimension of it, and even picking the right people for what you have to accomplish. So to me, the starting point for setting a team up for success lies in at least three areas. One is really knowing and understanding the business strategy and the goals. So what are the executives of the board trying to accomplish? What are the P&L owners in the business trying to accomplish? And how can you connect the dots between what you may see as an innovation leader as priorities and driving the goals that the P&L owners in the business care about? So that's the first thing, is really knowing and understanding what the strategy is. The second is deeply understanding your audience and all of your stakeholders. So obviously, especially customers and prospective customers. So being specific and fact-based about who is it that your brand really wants to do business with, and what are their needs, not just their rational needs, but also their emotional needs that it can drive them to want to connect to your brand. And then, what are the problems that you want to solve for them and that you can solve for them, where innovations represent a potential opportunity. And the third thing is having the innovation appropriate processes and tools in place so your team can execute. So one of the biggest challenges I saw my teams face persistently in doing it, in trying to drive innovation in big old companies, is there's a tendency to kind of apply, you've got a tool set and capabilities and mindsets that are really good for managing a giant business at scale, which usually means controlling risk is a big priority. And not only are they utterly inappropriate for innovation, but they actually turn out to be innovation killers. So really understanding what are the capabilities when you have the great people and you understand your customers' needs and the problems you want to solve, the tools and the capabilities, the processes, the policies. Those are the things that the great people you bring on board really require in order to be successful.
Super. So what I'm hearing is there are these really important components to make things actually commercially successful. And all of that's sort of invisible, I think, to a lot of people who haven't worked in this field. And it's something that actually, how did you, I guess one follow-up question to that is, how did you identify all those areas along the way? Like, was that something, was that sort of a trial and error, or how did all of that your experience lead you to those conclusions?
Yeah, the first answer that popped into my head as you started asking that question is by banging into a lot of walls. But I think, people come, I was kind of an accidental innovator, right? I got started on this journey in this field. I grew up professionally as a marketer. I sort of saw the opportunity for digital because my background was in direct marketing. So there was a real relevancy and connection there. And then one day in my CEO's office, he said, when I was at Citi, which was a massive credit card business, highly risk averse, highly regulated, people very proud of their success at the time. So not a lot of motivation to change, but my CEO was pretty forward thinking, highly intelligent, numbers oriented guy. He said to me, I want you to make us more innovative because we need to be innovative and we're not innovative. It's like, okay, boss, I'll go figure that out. But, I think a lot of us start with, well, I got to come up with some ideas. I have to go study the customer and find out what their needs are and come up with some prototypes and go do some market research. And that's almost the easy part. The really hard part is all this other stuff I'm talking about. Do you really understand what the business strategy is and goals and the business drivers and how you can connect to them? Because that's really critical for getting buy-in, for getting capital internally, for building credibility and having people trust you. And do you understand, do you have the capabilities in place so your team can be successful? Because if you don't focus on capability building, kind of attacking the processes that are anathema to innovation, those things, your team's going to get frustrated and they're not going to be able to be successful. But it wasn't at first obvious to me that was where I'm going to spend my time. But late in my corporate career, I started to think of myself as, I was kind of the barrier remover. That a lot of my role and a lot of where I spent my time, and I have to say it wasn't always fun, but a lot of what became the priority for me as leader of the function was to make sure that I was helping to at least mitigate, if not remove, the barriers and obstacles that would slow my team down, frustrate people, cause great people to leave, and cause the organization to lose confidence in us.
Super. So that's actually a really good segue into a related topic, which is when we talked before, you said to me that figuring out who the right people are for your innovation team is important. But for the leader of that innovation team, making sure that the folks in your team are set up to succeed is actually at least as important. And so I think that's a really interesting comment, and I think we're going to talk about both of those areas here today because our audience, I'm sure, will be curious to hear about what that really means. So maybe first, give us a bit of an overview about how you go about finding the right people for your innovation team. What's your approach, and what does that really mean to you?
Right. Well, so first of all, like defining who the right people are, and I think that really depends. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious to say this, but it's important. Who is going to be successful as an innovator in your culture? And in the case of, being in financial services and insurance, it's not just do people have the technical and functional skills, but do they have the resilience, the persistence, the influence skills, the communication skills, the negotiation skills, because you're always negotiating with your colleagues to get, our team was nothing without the collaboration and really active support from people in many, many functions around the companies that I work for. And so it's that leader, do they have the leadership profile, and do they really understand that the role is not just coming up with great concepts and pursuing them, but that you have to take on the internal challenges and see them as, well, this is another set of challenges that I need to overcome versus this is a brick wall and I'm angry at the fact that this brick wall exists. So it's thinking through, do you have people who really see it as a challenge to overcome versus, oh, I can't deal with this. And then it's really considering what is your innovation model. So in our case, in the organizations I work for, I was always very committed to an internal model versus I was never in favor of, pitching a tent in Silicon Valley, and taking things outside. So depending upon what your model is, that's also going to inform what kind of people do I need. And then if you're already at the point where you've identified some concepts and trends that you work on, obviously you may want some particular expertise. But the last point I'll make on this topic is that really important to think about your team, not just the people in your, reporting line, but who's that? I know we're going to talk about, what I like to think of as the coalition of the willing, but that broader base of support that you need internally, because you're never going to want to have everything inside your team for lots of reasons. And also, where do you need such specialized expertise that you're going to go outside the company, that it just makes no sense to bring those people internal. And we did that lots of times to great effect. Really important, almost like I thought about our outside resources as an extension of our team. Not consultants who came and told us what to do, but people who brought expertise on all of the hows of innovation.
So maybe give us an example about how you brought that kind of expertise in. Just because I think it's interesting, like the various models of, paid experts or boards of advisors or just people, or in your network organically, just phoning up people. Yeah. What's your kind of recommended approach in terms of getting that kind of expertise?
Yeah, I did all of them. I often think, I grew up, I'm in the middle of 5 children, and it was a very tough, competitive household. And I think my resilience and sort of can-do-ness probably started, at the dinner table in childhood, but I tried a little bit of everything depending upon the problem. So a couple of concrete examples of how we worked with outside partners. When I became the global chief innovation officer at Citi, we got involved in a project in Singapore to create a branch that was essentially a digital wall inside the Singapore metro. And for those of you who are familiar with the Singapore market, half of the population of Singapore rides the metro every day. And the metro is it's not like New York City where I live. I mean, you could eat off the floor in the Singapore metro. And we had no expertise in doing this kind of project, nor did the team on the ground in Singapore. We networked our way somehow, I don't remember exactly how, but to the design firm that was engaged in the original design of the first Apple stores. So that was a very exciting resource to work with, not only because they have the expertise, but, we were like headquarters in New York working with this team. And, usually, people out in the markets had little time for corporate, right? So it was tremendous for our relationship that we could bring forward that kind of resource. Another example was when we were one of the first financial institutions to implement RFID payments, contactless payments in a rapid transit system. And this was before the iPhone. So it's like the Stone Age compared to where we are now. And our idea was to create a tag that you could attach to your keyring that would have the RFID chip in the tag. And so you could swipe it at the turnstiles. And so again, we had, our only expertise in physical product was plastic. I was surrounded by lots of people who knew how to develop, the best plastic, the best credit card on earth, but we didn't know anything about, other products. And we went out and sourced a very innovative packaging expert. And I wish I had the tag here to show you. I forgot to bring it to the call. It was great. People loved it, and they loved the way it felt. They loved the way it looked. And it really helped with the implementation. We never would have had that expertise in-house, and we didn't need to internalize it because it was a kind of one and done project.
That's super. Thank you so much for that. And you were talking about the coalition of the willing. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that phrase actually means, and a little bit more about these ideas of leadership, innovation leadership?
Yeah. So I'll be really candid about this one. So it's like, I always found when I was in my roles, whether I was head of digital or a chief innovation officer, you've got people in the organization, not the people on the top, the people in the middle and people coming up in their careers who are looking at these appointments and saying, wow, thank God management gets it. The appointment of a senior person to own these things and saying, like, they get it. Like, the world is moving forward, and here's somebody who's going to lead us forward. And those people self-identify. They're the people who, when I would make a presentation at a town hall, they always came to me with questions, or they sent me an email, or they reached out for help on something, or they came to me for career advice. And so you kind of can find those people organically pretty easily because they will raise their hands. And as we developed the processes that were fit for the purpose of what we were trying to do, like a big one was how we developed a pipeline of ideas to test. We would invite those people to our work sessions. And so not only did they bring great content and expertise and real enthusiasm, but they became advocates informally around the rest of the organization. And they became people upon whom we could depend to implement. They became people who would post into open jobs in my group. They would refer people. So just by listening and observing and creating ways for those people to self-identify, it's pretty easy to find them.
Mm-hmm. Wait, but question for you, Amy, how did you manage like the official nature of that role in terms of like whether people were kind of formally a part of your project or not, or were people just very open and intrigued and interested to in some way play a role?
Yeah. So it depended. So, and it depended upon their managers, right? So one area where I would say my resource pools were get approval for jobs in my team, and I could actually fill those roles internally or externally. Ad hoc invitations to people for things like brainstorming small, low commitment projects. Then can I get the outside people who I talked about a couple of examples, and then I need some dedicated people from another part of the business to help me. And the two areas that I really focused on were decision analytics and risk management, right? And so we're lending, I'm thinking about banking, we were a lending business, so risk is pretty important. And we had the regulations to always concern ourselves with. So we really needed dedicated resources who could help us. And at least at Citi, the decision analytics team, they were the arbiters of the truth. Their stake was only in advising management on fact-based analytics. And so it was really important to get dedicated analytics and support. And I had to lobby for that. It took time. It took time to prove to the executives running those functions that they should dedicate resources. And it was a lot of personal relationship building and trust. You can make all the business cases you want, but you've got to build trust relationships with the people who can allocate those resources to you. And that was really what made it happen for my team.
Right. It's so interesting, this kind of combination of, or curation, perhaps you could call it, of people, the coalition of the willing, the external experts, the people internally who were really necessary because their function was critical to the success of the project. So I guess, that's kind of the principle I think that you're talking about, is that it really requires, it takes a village.
It does. And I'll tell you, it's interesting. I'm sitting here thinking, I work a lot with my life now. I have many elements to what I do these days. And I'm mainly advising people in let's say, big old companies on how to transform. I also have advisory relationships with startups, and I'm an investor in an early stage fund, and I sit on the screening committee. So I deal with a lot of founders, and the things we were doing, I guess I didn't think about it then, but my team and I had to be really scrappy about getting resources, much in the way that a founder does. Startups and big companies like to think they're really different from each other, but they're not. I mean, your investors may not be a VC. Your investors are the CFO and the C-suite, and the board. And you are still racing the clock to build credibility and prove outcomes. And you're never going to have enough resources. So this sort of scrappiness, you can't wait for the reorg to get a couple of heads allocated to you. That's very old school. You have to find ways to move and not hold yourself to the old ways of getting resources. They're not going to work. They're going to be insufficient.
Mm-hmm. And what's maybe an example of something that didn't go so well, or a struggle that you had across your career, in terms of specifically related to leading teams and innovation? I mean, there's always the budget struggle, as you're referring to.
I have a long list of those. I say that maybe my next book could be called something like, could be full of the advice to my former self. I think where I struggled personally sometimes, and where my team struggled, was really being proactive enough about connecting what we were doing very explicitly to the priorities of the P&L owners. We were say either even when I was a chief marketing officer in insurance, or a chief digital or innovation officer in financial services, I did not own a P&L, right? And the power center in these big old companies is with the P&L owners. I was, on a bad day, I was called a cost center. On a good day, I was called a center of excellence, right? And so at the end of the day, everything that my team did was charged back to a P&L owner in some kind of allocation process. So it all comes down to accounting. And because of our accounting model, it was very hard to attribute the impact we were having to individual P&L owners. It was across the board, average benefits. Mm-hmm. And so breaking through those realities more quickly, and that's why I talk about trust and the relationships, is going to help you. And that's just a dynamic that needs a lot of attention when you're in the kind of companies that I work for. So there were projects that did not go through because we just could not be convincing enough about connecting those dots. One example that I shared with you before the call is we were doing work a long time ago on how people feel about change in their lives. And we actually went into people's homes and looked at their change strategies. And I'm sure everybody in this call has, if you still even have change, you've got some way, there's cookie jars and all kinds of crazy things that people do. So we have this idea, like, what if we round up people's transactions on their credit card statement to the next whole dollar? And so we had this concept that internally was called the whole dollar card. And people in research were saying, and then we're going to match them. People in research are saying, this is like a 401k plan, which you think about it, we're giving them 33 cents and they're likening it to retirement plan. But this is brilliant. We're like patting ourselves on the back about this idea. We go to the P&L owner who had to fund the test. They're like, we have cash back. It's the same thing. Well, emotionally to our customers, it was not the same thing, but we could not get over that hurdle. And so the idea, it died. It's funny. I still have the decks at home. I console myself with them. About a year after the idea was killed, Bank of America launched a program called Keep the Change. That was almost identical to what we had come up with a year earlier, claimed to have booked, 1 or 2 million new accounts off of it. Mm-hmm. So it was just one of those things where you say, okay, what can I do? But we were just unable to close that gap.
Yeah, that story reminds me. Yes, it's like a principle I think that all innovators experience, which is this kind of attitude of, oh, we've tried that before.
Well, we already have that covered.
Right.
And in that case, it was locking into yes, functionally, one could make the argument that cash back versus whole dollar met the same functional need, but emotionally, the reaction was totally different. And, loyalty and referral and people keeping and using your product and making it the primary product in your category, it comes from how you make people feel. It doesn't come from what you do. And so I think, certainly in the financial services sector, although we all are highly emotional about our own money, when you're in the boardroom or you're looking at the Excel spreadsheets, empathy doesn't fit in a spreadsheet. And I think it's easy for colleagues to forget or not focus on the value of how you make people feel about the product or service you're offering to them. And we just missed on that one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, in a couple of minutes, we're going to open up for Q&A, but I wanted to ask you kind of a final question, which is, if you could shortcut the trial and error and learnings that you've had about building and maintaining a successful innovation team, what would be like the 2 principles that you think people should walk away from this session knowing?
I think it goes back to definitely make sure you understand the current business model and the priorities of whoever owns the P&L, and find ways to connect those dots. It doesn't mean you're only going to come up with short-term small wins. You can come up, I was in a business of 30 or 40 million customers. We focused on paper elimination, which in those days, may not seem sexy, but it was a really big deal. And people cared about it, as it may not be exciting, but it builds credibility. So I think really focusing on the business model, that's the starting point to understanding how you can shift the business model, right? You've got to understand, before you want to break it and change it, you got to understand what it is. And for me, those analytics partnerships were critical. And so I can't imagine, no matter what business you're in, that it isn't vital to have very strong analytics partnerships who bring skills that you may not be able to internalize your team. It's really hard to find those people. So get those people to help you. And again, not just because they have the skills, but because they bring a lot of credibility to the conversation with the senior executives. They make your argument a lot more believable than you might be able to make it on your own. Mm-hmm. So I think I would do those 2 things.
You've mentioned the word credibility like 4 times in the past couple of minutes. So I think that's a really interesting. I mean, you're using it in different ways, but I think what you're saying is just that sometimes innovators are so focused on what's actually happening with projects that they forget the role of themselves in the equation and making things successful.
You can't underestimate how important it is, and not for the leader, but for everybody on the team, to understand that they're not just doing their project every day, but they're influencing the other stakeholders in the organization who, in the end, you're going to need to scale your brilliant successes. And so you have this double role of doing the work and bringing everybody else along. And look, patience is not a word that's in my dictionary. And so one of the things I personally have, I see it and I want it, and I want to run as fast as possible. You have to move, you have to choose the projects, especially early on, where you can get your colleagues to want to follow your lead and keep up with you. Because if you run too far down the road, people who are responsible for delivering the daily and weekly results are going to discount you and not see you as credible to what they have to accomplish.
So just one last question on that before we get to the Q&A. What percentage do you think of your role when you were leading these innovation teams, for example, at Citi, was spent doing projects like thinking content work versus internal socialization and getting kind of buy-in for the work that you did for your team?
Yeah.
What percentages? Yeah. What would be the breakdown, do you think?
I'd say it became more and more the buy-in, outward facing to the rest of the organization. And I, in retrospect, I would put even more time and energy into that. Towards the end of my corporate career, it became, for me personally, hard because I really liked doing the work and didn't expect that so much of it would be focused on the other stuff, call it the politics, the bigger picture, that you've got to focus on that stuff, but you really have to do both. And that's part of why I love what I do now, that I do the work. But it's, you move away from that and you've got to focus on convincing the organization and understanding how you can demonstrate to them that you're meeting their needs. You're almost there to make them successful. Yep.
Like they're a customer almost.
They are a really important customer. Yeah. Especially those P&L owners and all the risk managers who are probably afraid of what you're doing. And they're half afraid. And so you have to and I'll say one last thing about that. I think innovators, we love to pitch our ideas and how great they are. Keep in mind that a lot of the people around you in the organization, they're more worried about what can go wrong. And so at the same time that you're pitching how great your idea is, you've got to invest some percentage of your message in helping them understand how you're de-risking the innovation that you're trying to pursue. That's what they really need to hear before they're going to be, in order to be open to your idea.
Got it. So Amy, thank you so much for all of that great insight. Let's kick off the Q&A now, and feel free to add things to the chat now if you have some questions about basically anything related to our topic. But I will start off with a question that I somehow think is on everybody's minds these days in innovation, which is related to AI, of course. Yeah. And my question is really, Amy, how do you think AI is going to affect our innovation roles? And also this, how is it going to affect innovation leaders, like people who are running teams? So I guess kind of, what do you think is the impact of all of this technology on innovation teams and how they will work in the future?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that the impact is going to be profound. And I was in the audience of a really great talk earlier this week where one of the speakers said that the question in the boardrooms that people are asking is AI a tool, a teammate, or a terminator? And they're trying, companies are trying, and I think innovation leaders have to ask themselves that same question. So, how can AI present tools for you to be more effective, move faster, get better insights, understand your customers better? How can AI be a teammate? Almost that you're working alongside in your roles, but also where the terminator, either threats or opportunities. And I'd say for an innovator, they're opportunities, but they also mean that jobs are going to go away. I think the absolute imperative for innovators is to think about how do you need to upskill and reskill, and how are you going to innovate how you innovate based on AI, and ask yourself those questions and set some goals for the coming months to start to frame the answer.
Super. So actually, Sherry had put into the chat, could you, Amy, please talk a little bit more about the de-risking issue vis-a-vis the sell-in of big, bold ideas? De-risking, I guess, versus selling them in. I don't know, Sherry, feel free to come off mute if you wanted to further clarify the question.
No, I think I love the term de-risking, and I think particularly in a organization that may not have a specific innovation incubator, or even talk as much about innovation as you should. I think the idea of de-risking is really critical, and I'm just curious about sort of key steps that you can take to be sure that you've got the right amount of information to sell in the idea, but also don't spend so much time overanalyzing that you miss the window of opportunity, especially in a world where pivoting quickly has become the norm, not the exception.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I think about that, it's a great question, Sherry. I think about one of the best ways to de-risk the work of any innovation team is first of all, have a portfolio of bets, and it's this notion of fail fast, fail cheap. Of course, nobody likes to talk about failure, but the reality is we fail all the time, and it's okay if we learn. But if the earlier you can gather evidence that your idea has merit through very low cost, low fidelity prototypes and bring people along with you, you take out the risk. So how much can you learn through prototyping and friendly user testing, which costs almost nothing, versus going out into market and building something which is expensive? So it's like it's thinking about how much can I learn quickly at very low cost through prototyping to build more and more evidence that my idea may have merit, and invest appropriately relative to what you know. So hopefully that's clear. But I saw,
it's a great approach. Piloting, prototyping. I mean, certainly in brick and mortar businesses like I'm in the restaurant industry, the more that you can do, and ideally you can do it in a skunk works where, we've done that in the past where we literally took over a warehouse and built the inside of a new restaurant because you had to be out of the eyes of your competitors while you were testing, and, gave you a chance to bring in guests and let them try things. Again, not in your operating locations. And that Skunkworks was actually one of my most fun projects, and a great way to prove the proposition before we took it to market, because you could undo something, you could retry it, you could reset it up in the world of creating it like a Disney back lot. And it was a great way to do it. So love that idea of piloting and prototyping to the best that you can on a low-cost basis and let it prove the proposition.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And the other piece of it is, the other thing about risk is that, this work is really messy. And people in big old companies don't like things that are messy. People want everything to be neat and organized and fit in the spreadsheet and be very predictable. And innovation has never been like that. And now the world is totally not like that. So it's understanding the emotional reaction to things being messy. And I think pulling people in early. Some people will respond well to that. Getting people to move away from imposing old metrics on evaluating an early concept. Because if you can't produce an ROI, people will think that's really risky. But you know what? To expect an ROI on something that's in prototype is completely inappropriate. So moving the conversation on metrics is also really helpful to taking away the risk. When our CEO was great, and he was a former CFO, so he was like totally a numbers guy. When we met with him to talk about early stage concepts, and we would go to him and talk about business models, we had business model diagrams with no numbers. So our early conversations would be, well, what's our best guess about the primary drivers of revenue and expense would be, primary drivers of revenue and expense, and what would we have to believe to get 1% market share? So it was a very qualitative conversation. We didn't even have numbers on the page. So you set that expectation early on, and people say, oh, I get it. And you'll be able to move some people along in the conversation, but you've got to run the conversation like that. Don't let it happen to you. You have to change the conversation about metrics.
Great perspective, Amy. Thank you.
Actually, I have a follow-up question to that, Amy, quickly, which is, have you seen any good examples of people who, or tools or anything that you've worked on that has kind of summarized how innovation works differently? You know what I mean? Like from thinking only about numbers to thinking about 5 other criteria for success, because I think that what happens is that these conversations happen in a silo in that one project where you then are trying to explain, okay, let's think about different metrics here in this example. But there's so many topics within the work that we do that really have different metrics than the core business. And it's a matter of somehow socializing that and getting a broader interest in that and a broader understanding of that amongst leadership in big companies. And I think that's something we all really struggle with. Do you have any ideas of how people can not have to maybe teach it per se, or not be so formal about it, but a way that it can be communicated that would be well received?
Right. Well, I didn't come to this meeting expecting to pitch my book, but you could certainly take a look at my book around my website, and you'll see, because it was all about how can I help people overcome all of these issues? And there's a whole section on metrics. So you could take a look at my book, although I promise I was not coming to this call to pitch my book. I think it all comes down to the people who you bring onto the team and the relationship with your analytics partners. And you need really outstanding critical thinkers. People who ask questions, who spend a lot of time asking questions before they jump to solutions, and the great thing about my analytics partners is they have that deep technical skill in modeling and analysis and statistics, the stuff that I never wanted to deal with, but I knew I had to be surrounded by great partners who could help me. And they were also incredibly open-minded and energized about using their skills to build the future. So they were willing to sort of jump into that, mud pit of exploration around the data and find insights that we would not have found if we got about doing things with traditional analytics tools. So I think you need that combination of the innovators and the great critical thinker, open-minded analyst, just get in a room and start to ask questions. There's not a formulaic answer that applies every place, but that is a tactic that any innovation team can benefit from.